signs that you or a loved one might be in a cult. Now, please note this is very different to most of the videos on my channel, I understand that, but for some time now I felt called to talk more about this, and what I'm going to be talking about here comes from my own experience of having left a spiritual cult that I was in for 2.5 years. I left sometime at the early last year at the time of recording of this video. But also what I will be sharing here is a lot of things that I came across in the process of leaving, in the process of processing my leaving, research into cults and how they operate. So what you'll find here is a mix of my own experience, but also what I found from that research that I found applicable in what I'm sharing here. Now, please note, if any of these signs are starting to resonate with you, you're starting to wonder about this, seek support, talk to somebody. Don't just go based off what I've said, but if you're starting to feel a little bit of insecurity or uncertainty about something I've said here, reach out to somebody who's not, in my opinion, linked to the cult in any way. Talk to somebody that, if you have somebody that is an unbiased or impartial third party who wants what is best for you and is willing to hear you out. So before I get any more into the signs, personally I found that interventions don't really work, and so this is why I'm saying talk to somebody that will hear you out. It really comes down to you deciding you want out. If it comes to that point, I can make another video on that kind of a topic about interventions and why I don't believe they work, if somebody's interested in that, if they're worried about somebody who might be in a particular cult. In this video I'm not going to be talking about the cult specifically. Also, let me know if you'd like to know more about that. I'm going to be talking about these signs that I found are applicable to not just spiritual cults, because that's, in my view, the truth. I've also experienced cults in many forms that are not purely only spiritual, although the one that I feel is probably the most recent and the most prominent in my own experience is that particular cult that I left, and so I wanted to talk about it here. So let's get into it. I will give some signs here. These are not the only signs, but these for me are the most clear, or the clearest signs that I found, at least for this, that are also applicable in other cults that I've come across. The first, the clearest sign of all for me, is fear-based control. Now, it's a sign that, in my view and my experience, isn't so obvious from the get-go. And if you look at a lot of cult research, what they talk about is that in the beginning, when there's a new recruit or when somebody is sort of assessing the cult or has come into the cult, what you'll find is something called love bombing. Initially, that person is shown or is showered with a lot of love, a lot of care, a lot of attention. Not necessarily always the case, but some select few recruits very often will receive that. But then with time, as you start to recognize what's going on, what's really going on underneath the surface, you'll start to recognize that order is maintained in the structure, or even the hierarchy, because there will very typically be some kind of a leadership or authority hierarchy in the cult, is maintained through fear-based control. So one other way that you start to see this is that there's an inability to ask critical questions. Basically, your ability to think critically and ask questions, specifically if you're questioning the narrative or questioning what's being told to you, that ability to ask questions is shut down. Maybe initially they're a little bit more lenient with you, especially if you're new, but if you've started climbing the ranks, so to speak, of this authority structure in such an organization, in a cult, if you start to ask questions, you'll start to be punished. And this is where the fear-based control comes in. You're not allowed to think for yourself. You're not allowed to think differently. You have to conform to the narrative, to the party line, to the story, to the doctrine, to the dogma, whatever is being put forward by the cult. You have to adhere to that if you wish to remain within good standing, or if you wish to remain in the cult and not be punished, right? So if you start to question things, or you start to resist or even defy or rebel against some of the mandates or some of the rules or some of the things being put forward, you will start to be punished, and that's also where that fear-based control comes in. Cult members or cult leaders don't want members of the cult to be independent and freely thinking individuals. They don't want to have the individuals be sovereign, because with time they'll realize that the cult is based on a lie. Now, the lie might even have grains of truth scattered through it, but ultimately they want to control the resources. And so what often happens also, if you follow the money, so to speak, or whatever the means of control also that the cult exerts to control its cult members, if you follow that, you'll start to see that resources are siphoned off. And what happens is those at the top of the pyramid, very often, it might just be the leaders, as was the case in the most recent cult that I left. The leaders at the top were very well off. But anyone else, a member of the cult, was paying huge amounts of money to sustain the leaders, and also giving a whole lot of power to them regarding their life decisions, regarding very important decisions like who they would be coupled up with in a relationship, perhaps even in some cases what their identity was in terms of what gender they identified as. Now, all of this is what I'm talking about. It comes down to control and fear-based control. Unless you fall in line, you're going to fall out of favor. So something else which is a very clear sign is some form of dehumanization. So it might come in the form of if you start to ask questions, if you start to challenge the narrative or challenge the dogma or the doctrines. Sometimes you'll be called names, derogatory names, or sometimes members who are perhaps falling out of line, or those who've decided to leave the cult, those are also very often within the realm of the cult called names and dehumanized. And very often that fear-based control kicks in and people are told to cut all contact, that even being in contact with the people who have left threatens your own standing or position within the cult. And it also, they, at least in my case, they suggested that it could threaten your own sort of spiritual well-being, right? Like basically that you'd be selling your soul, if I was to reduce it to terms we might understand. If you associate with such people, you're putting your soul's well-being or your spiritual well-being, or you're selling your soul by being in contact with them. Obviously, that is a lie. So the other thing is, for another sign, a very clear sign in my case too, that I experienced was incongruence or inconsistency between the teaching that they put forward and how it was actually put into practice within the realms of the cult. So if the doctrine, at least in the spiritual cult I was in, is preaching peace and love and harmony, and even in some cases preaching trusting yourself or listening to your intuition or trusting your inner guidance. However, if you actually started to, for example, love yourself or wanted to express love and care and concern and compassion to those around you, if that conflicts with the mandates or the regulations of the cult, then you would start to experience that incongruency, as though the rules didn't apply or don't apply to the leaders, even though they're very, very strict rules placed on the members. And maybe some of those rules are also a little bit less strict on some of the members higher up. However, there's also another sign of being in a cult, and it's not just incongruence between the teaching or the doctrine and that those particular rules don't apply to the leaders. It's also that there is this inconsistency in rules sort of going forward within the cult. For example, when you first join, you might be told one thing, but then it's as though that line is always moved. And you'll hear things like, oh, because, things are always changing, or, it's like, well, we're learning new things, or we're evolving, or we're growing, or we're, adapting. And it can always be explained away. However, when it comes to that inconsistency, if you start to recognize the emotions that you're going through, it's an emotional roller coaster. It's so that you can never feel completely safe and stable. And then we're coming back to that fear-based control, because if they are always if they're always shifting the rules so that you cannot find your own footing, you don't have the space to really start to think clearly and really have the space to question things or reflect on things, and because you're always trying to fall in line with the changing rules, right? It keeps you in that position of vigilance and stress and fear. And fear prevents you from thinking critically. So that's why I mentioned those two things at the start. Once you once you hijack somebody's fear-based neural pathways in their brain, they cannot think very critically. They're not using their prefrontal cortex so much to think about things rationally and critically and taking their time. You introduce this artificial sense of stress and urgency, and so they're trying to fall in line, just reacting to that fear. So another very clear sign, especially I think probably, but not only actually in spiritual cults, is there is a form of hypnosis, and what happens is that members are put into a kind of a trance. And in my case, the way that was often done was through inducing forms of healing, where you hijack somebody's sort of innate methods of resisting. And here is another interesting thing: in spiritual sort of realms, the idea of resistance is frowned upon. It's seen as a bad thing if you're resisting, whereas resistance might actually be very natural. If you resist something that doesn't feel right to you, if you are choosing to, for example, defend yourself, stand up for yourself, there is a form of resistance there, and that's not evil, it's not bad. However, resistance is looked down upon because it's your means by exerting your own, or strengthening your own boundaries, standing up for yourself and knowing your own sovereign power. So they want to override that. So another way is very often spoke about is something called a word salad, where this is not my term, but where cult leaders will talk jabberish, like they won't make a whole lot of sense, but it's on the members to try and interpret meaning from what the cult leader or anyone who's parroting that particular narrative has said. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and when you start to ask questions critically about this, then you can start to see this really doesn't make sense. Like, it's not backed up by anything. And so when you place the responsibility or the onus on the individual members to come up with a meaning, that means the leaders don't have to. And they can say whatever they want, really, in that sense. I'm not saying everything they say is word salad, but it's very often the case that when they're giving sermons or when they're imparting some kind of spiritual message, because you can induce a spiritual experience within yourself and assume it's as a result of being connected to the leader, but it actually has very little to do with what they're saying. And one clear way you can actually look at this is if, for example, or recognize this, a member asks the question. I saw this too. They'd be like, but what does this mean? And they'd be told something like, you'll be able to see clearly when you tune in and listen with your heart, or something like that. Now, that's really interesting, because I do believe there is a way that we can connect with our heart and be centered in our heart and be able to receive a message. However, what they're doing there is hijacking that concept as a means to control the person, so that they, it's like, well, you don't need clarity from me, you figure it out, right? And what that does also is, very often if you ask a cult leader about something that they might have said, say you asked them for help or support, or you asked them for an answer and they gave you an answer some weeks ago and you come back to them with that, what I've seen very often happens, not only by the leaders, but those that are higher ups and enforcing their particular doctrine or the structure of the cult, what will happen is if you confront them with that and say, but I remember you said this, they'll dismiss it with, oh, I don't even remember. I was channeling in the moment. I don't remember what I said. Pretty convenient, right? Like, for me, that's a massive, massive red flag. Because cult leaders very typically are looked up to by members in the cult. Members in the cult will make huge life decisions based on their finances, on, like I said, who they're choosing to be coupled up with, who they consider themselves to be, maybe making huge life decisions based on things the cult leader will tell them. And then when you challenge the cult leader on what they've said, there's zero accountability, and all the responsibility, all of the liabilities placed on those individual members, even if they were just following orders. That is massively concerning. They want you not to think for yourself and just carry out their orders, but they also don't want to be accountable. Now, this is why I personally encourage in my videos taking responsibility for yourself, because in that sense you are. However, if you understand the context of this, you can see how problematic it is. So another very, very clear sign, and this for me personally was actually, I believe, part of how I was able to exit the cult. It wasn't from anybody rescuing me. It wasn't from an intervention, even though some of my friends outside of the cult did try that. What happens when you join a cult in this particular way is that the identity that you start to associate as you, who you start to think of as yourself, changes when you're in a cult. So outside of the setting of that cult, because it is artificial, it is constructed, it is based on this doctrine, it's somehow, formed from however this cult, whatever principles, whatever teaching they have, there is a fake identity, a cult identity that you start to believe is who you truly are. It isn't who you truly are, but you start to believe it. And so you'll recognize that any time away from the cult, even a few hours, that cult identity starts to disintegrate, because it requires the cult and everyone sort of buying into that false teaching, fake identity, for you to believe it is true. Now, depending on how deeply you are in the cult, in my case, in certain points when I was in the cult, I would say, quite deeply brainwashed. So a few hours away didn't make so much of a difference. But when I was spending a few days away from that influence, I started to see the difference much more. And this is also why cults very often want to isolate you and separate you from the life you had previously. So they want to very often cut you off from family members, or even you might even start to choose to do that. In my case, I did it. No one told me to do it. It sort of just became a fact of like, well, the cult accepts me, and I started to identify with this identity of the cult persona, but those in my life from before don't acknowledge that, don't see that, they don't understand that. And so I sort of naturally started to migrate more of my life into the cult, started pouring all of my attention and resources, stopped spending time with those friends or family members for some time, even stopped talking to them. However, the difference was that, and I was very blessed in my case, I was very lucky. Like, a lot of those people that I was once close to were still open to reconnecting with me. They chose to love me unconditionally. Yes, they were hurt from it, but once I reconnected with them, and I could really see they meant me no harm. They really loved me unconditionally. They were sad that I had been gone from their lives for some time. However, anytime I would bring something up within the cult that was going against this party line, even though they professed unconditional love, the opposite thing happened. I was traumatized. I mean, for some months after being in the cult, I experienced symptoms of PTSD. And I think that the very clear difference there is, once you recognize that you are not that cult identity and you no longer want to be that, because it's a fake identity, so it doesn't last. And being in the cult robs you of your life force energy. All of that love and attention and money is being siphoned off to support the structure and support the leaders at the top, while those members who are in lower ranks are becoming poorer and poorer. Another massive sign of a cult is if the leaders at the top are increasingly more well off, while those at the bottom are overworked. And I say bottom because it is a pyramid structure. It's not that I see members in the bottom structures or bottom hierarchy as less than. I don't see them as that. But this idea within the cult that the more you love the leaders, or the more blessed you are by God, and they will say crap like that, the closer you are to them, or the closer you are to the top. But meanwhile, those at the bottom of this hierarchy are giving their blood, sweat, tears, and and love and energy and money and resources, working for free and being unappreciated, uncompensated. And so once you start to recognize that you don't want this, because how could you possibly stay there? It's not sustainable. It's not maintainable. Everyone has a breaking point. And once you start to recognize there's a life outside of the cult, a very, very good life you can live, you no longer want to participate. I recognize more and more I didn't want to go back. I dreaded going back into it. I felt more and more relieved. I felt more connected. I felt more alive again. I felt more at ease and more at peace outside of the cult. However, the cult line will try and tell you, oh yeah, it's because of this and this, and come up with all kinds of stupid reasons. But really, it's not something that can last. So if you start to recognize that you feel like you are not the same person when you're in that cult, that for me is a massive, massive red flag. No matter what you try, you're not going to find happiness in the cult. You're not going to find happiness conforming, trying to serve some leader or guru, whatever they call themselves. And I think another thing I will say is that if you start to pay attention to what the guru is saying, they will make, or leader or whatever, they will make promises, they will make prophecies, or they'll make statements of this is going to happen or this is going to happen, and all of that stuff typically falls flat. And that's how you know that they're false. Anyone who's predicting that they know better for you, or that this thing is going to happen and then it doesn't come through and doesn't come to be, and then they have some lame excuse for that, that's another very clear sign. But ultimately, if you've recognized any of these signs might be true for you, trust yourself. Trust that you have the way to navigate out and that you can get out. There is no point at which you can truly actually have to stay there. You are allowed to leave. And they will tell you you can't, and they will maybe say, take your soul hostage or your peace of mind, and psychologically manipulate you and brainwash you to think that leaving is somehow going to condemn you to hell or some version of that. But that's all bullshit. You do get to leave. So I know that this video is very different to my other videos. Thank you so much for watching this. If this is something you'd like to hear more about, I know that it's very different, but if it is, let me know. And there are some more things that I can cover, like how personally I found I was able to leave. I gave some insight into that in this video, but I can also talk more about why I feel interventions in my case weren't helpful and why I think that is. Otherwise, if you are in this situation or you know somebody who is, take some time, look at actual research. Doesn't have to be just this video. Please don't only go based on this. Look for yourself, research for yourself, come to your own knowing of what is true, and trust that the truth will always be revealed to you. Alright, thank you so much for joining me in this video. Take care on your journey. Bye.